Welcome and thank you for joining the Benefits and Business of Thermal Energy Networks. I'm Jonathan Dowds. I'm the Deputy Director at Renewable Energy Vermont, or REV. REV is the trade association for the renewable community defined broadly here in Vermont, and our mission is to get to a 100% renewable energy future. We know that in order to do that, we need a diverse set of clean generating technologies, think wind and solar, as well as clean consumption technologies, think electric vehicles and thermal networks, which we're going to talk about today. This is absolutely necessary to get where we need to go on both our climate and our energy goals. So we're very excited to be hosting this webinar, helping bring some attention to a technology that will be part of the deep bench of clean energy technologies that we need to successfully make this transition. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass the torch to Debbie New, who's the coordinator at the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance, and she can talk a bit about what thermal networks actually are.
Thank you. And I'm going to say a few words and then pass it back to Jonathan, but we're going to try to get you to our speakers as quickly as possible because we have three wonderful national experts here with us today, Zeyneb Magavi, Jeff Hammond, and Ryan Dougherty, and I'll tell you more about them later. But first, this is the final webinar in a series that's been exploring how we can implement geothermal and other kinds of thermal energy networks in Vermont. I'm excited about this one for two reasons. First, because we'll learn about how thermal networks can play an important role in electrifying our buildings. We'll talk about how they not only complement, but also support other solutions. Second, I'm excited about today's focus on businesses and communities. Thermal networks can be implemented by utilities and also by other entities. With the Inflation Reduction Act, which we'll hear more about, there's significant opportunity for communities, municipalities, nonprofits, and Vermont businesses. So we'll look at what's needed to make thermal networks a local energy solution in Vermont. I'm going to start briefly with the basics, beginning with what we mean by geothermal and thermal energy networks. You may often hear the word geothermal used for this way of heating and cooling buildings. In this case, we're not talking about deep geothermal, like you associate with Iceland or power plants, what's called supercritical hot rocks, which I think sounds like a great name for a band, but it's actually an energy system so far. These systems can be referred to as low-grade geothermal. They use relatively shallow boreholes and ground source heat pump technology. That's about harnessing ambient temperature and moving heat. It's been around for a long time, so it's a demonstrated mature technology, and it's still evolving. Today, we're also not talking about district steam from biomass or combustion-based systems. We're talking about mainly water in relatively shallow pipes, carrying temperature between the ground and buildings and among buildings. So let's break it down. When we're talking about thermal energy networks, the thermal refers to heating, of course, which we need a lot of in Vermont, but it also refers to cooling, which we'll need more and more as the climate warms. The kind of energy we're talking about is geothermal, in part from the ground, but it's also about capturing waste heat and energy from wastewater. These networks are closed loops of pipes that can efficiently exchange temperatures and balance thermal systems and thermal loads. So let's just look at a ground source heat pump in a single home. You're probably familiar with it. So briefly, when you turn on your heat, the ground source heat pump inside your home delivers warm air and extracts cold air like an air source heat pump. When you need cooling, the process reverses. The same heat pump delivers cold air and extracts heat, returning it to the earth where it's stored. In this case, in this illustration, the energy comes from underground, where water-filled pipes bring the earth's ambient temperature to your heat pump, where it's concentrated into hot or cold air as needed. A network system can bring the benefits of this highly efficient heating and cooling solution to more people. For example, in a town center, possibly like this one, buildings can be connected to vertical bores that are linked by horizontal pipes that form these closed loops, exchanging temperature with the earth and sharing it between buildings. So excess heating or cooling isn't wasted, but it can be exchanged between them. All this gets more efficient and possibly cost effective when we include the world of waste heat and wastewater as other sources of thermal energy. To bring these networked energy systems to Vermont, we have an opportunity to create the other kind of networks, people networks. In other words, businesses, nonprofits, government agencies, and communities working together to implement these systems. So far in Vermont, we have a bill at the State House, H242, that will allow existing utilities and other entities to finance thermal energy networks equitably using a utility model to access the needed capital and recover that investment in infrastructure through rates over time. We also have a network action team focused on a proof of concept and looking for a good first project. And we hope to have another session at the REV 2023 conference, so stay tuned. We're figuring it out. We welcome your ideas, your questions, and your help. And I'll pass it back to Jonathan.
Thanks, Debbie. I think we're really at a yes and moment when it comes to combating climate change. As I mentioned, we need more generation, we need more energy storage, we need more electrification, and it's really going to take a full ecosystem of complementary technologies to make that a reality. And what's exciting about looking at our energy systems from the systems perspective instead of an individual solar panel or an individual heat pump is that there's really a lot of dynamism in the way that these systems interact and the way that they can complement one another. As we add more electrification, we're actually adding also more flexibility and more resiliency to our system. And that's going to better match supply, enable us to match supply and demand using variable technologies like wind and solar. Thermal energy networks really have a lot of exciting elements to add here. We're going to hear our speakers talk about their importance in mitigating dramatic swings in energy demand between our shoulder seasons and our winter and summer heating and cooling seasons, which is really critical for avoiding the need of overbuilding renewables to match those peaks. And so thermal energy networks are something that can bring a lot of flexibility and a lot of balance to the system. I'm really excited to hear our speakers talk about that, and as I said, to help bring some visibility to this technology, which is a little bit less familiar here in Vermont than some of the others. I do get calls as the person who answers the phone here at REV from folks looking for home geothermal with some regularity. So if you are a geothermal installer, please get in touch with me so I know where to send them. But I think this networked component is going to be new for a lot of people, and I think its benefits and the role that it plays in that ecosystem is really exciting. So I will pause there and let Debbie introduce our speakers, and we can really get into the nuts and bolts of how these systems work and the many benefits they could potentially bring Vermonters.
Great. I'm going to introduce all our speakers at once and then hand it over to Zeyneb to start and just let them go. And as they speak, please put your questions in the chat. We'll collect them. We're trying to emphasize these speakers sharing all of their expertise with us. So the presentations today are a bit longer. There's a lot to share, and we may not have ample Q&A time, but we'll do what we can. And also your questions are really helpful as we develop an FAQ specific to Vermont and what Vermonters need to know. So we do welcome your questions, and we'll do the best we can. So today we have not one, not two, but three national leaders from the world of ground source heat pumps and thermal energy networks. Zeyneb Magavi is co-director of HEET, a nonprofit climate solutions incubator. She's also the energy behind the first gas utility run networked geothermal system in the country that's now underway in Framingham, Massachusetts. One reason this matters here is that Zeyneb and HEET have assembled a research team that includes MIT, UC Berkeley, and 2 national labs to study this project and make the data public. So we should be able to use that, and everyone would be able to use it. We also have Jeff Hammond, Executive Director of the International Ground Source Heat Pump Association, also known as IGSHPA, one of my favorite acronyms and fun to say. Jeff has a background in electrical engineering and over 35 years of experience in the ground source heat pump industry. He oversees and teaches industry certifications and is chair for the new ground source heat pump standards, which he'll talk about. And he has also, not that long ago, been to Vermont to teach about ground source heat pumps. I hope you'll come back. We also have Ryan Dougherty, president of Geo Exchange, who has deep experience in public policy and governance, including a multi-agency healthcare and human services framework and the roles of senior policy advisor at the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, and budget analyst and legislative liaison to the governor of Illinois. So we'll start with Zeyneb talking about thermal networks and electrification, then hear from Ryan and Jeff on the business case nationally with some ideas for Vermont. So thank you all three for being here, and Zeyneb, over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And as far as slide sharing goes, we'll hope that the computer gods are with us for the moment. All right, great. Excellent. It's lovely to be with you, and you have such amazing leaders in Vermont. You're very lucky. That was a lovely introduction to network geothermal. I will skip mostly some of these slides. I just want to comment here that HEET is a nonprofit that tries to work with all shareholders and as stakeholders in trust, and as such takes no money from industry, whether gas or geo, et cetera. So I'm going to focus on grounded thermal electrification pathway and it's the aspects of efficiency and economics in integrating with other aspects of our energy system. So next slide. I want to start by just taking a moment with this fun slide to acknowledge that none of us know exactly what our energy system is going to look like in 2050. Unfortunately, we are these scientists. And one of the things that we have to repeatedly do, and one of the things that I'm going to try to do for the next few minutes, is ask where the boundaries are of what our impacts are. So when we're talking about costs, for example, is it the cost of the system on the first day? Or is it the cost monthly to a user? Or is it the costs impacts on other aspects of the energy system? So where are our boundaries? Next slide. And this is the geekier version of the exact same thing. These are a whole bunch of different studies about electrification in Massachusetts and the different aspects of the system they're actually looking at. And so again, challenging our idea that when we think about costs and emissions and reduction, we've got to ask, what are we considering when we ask those questions about costs and emissions? Next slide. So we're going to jump right in. And this is a slide from a publication that was in Nature, Nature Scientific Reports. And it's going really, really big. So we're trying to back out and look at the whole elephant for a moment on the electric grid. So this is all US electric energy use for buildings from January to January. And this is today, commercial, industrial, residential. And as you can see, there's a summer peak. If you just click one more next. And then we're going to take all of the fossil fuel building energy use and magically wave a wand and switch it to electric. So that's all of our oil, our gas, the bit of coal out there, and making it some type of electrification for the building thermal. And what happens is we get what we're calling the Falcon curve. And it's a scary curve because the impact on the electric grid of taking our building heat, the way we keep our buildings warm, and making it electric depends on the type of technology we use. And that seems maybe a bit obvious, but it's something we hadn't really started talking about nationally or in most states. And that question of like, okay, if we take all of our gas boilers and we make them electric baseboard, a lot of us have the sense that that's going to use more electricity and also cost a bit. And so luckily no one's really planning to do that, but we've got the tips of the wings are electric baseboard heat with a really 100% efficiency. And as we switch from that to more efficient modern thermal technology, like the air source heat pump, the ground source heat pump, and the one we're going to be talking about more today, the network ground source heat pump or thermal energy network, you get a dramatic decrease in the peak in the winter. And this matters for winter climates, right? A decrease in that peak for the winter that does two things. First, if you did that electric baseboard and you switched all your buildings, that means you have to build out your electric grid. So you've got to invest a lot of money in electric grid infrastructure everywhere to support that. So that's cost and time, siting and time. And then the second thing it does is that the electric grid pricing, your cost for your electricity in whatever building you have, depends a huge part in the distance between the peak and the trough of the electric usage curve. That's something called the load factor. And so the more flat your electric usage curve is annually, the lower your price for electricity. And so having this kind of peak appear on our electric grid will not just slow us down from getting to our climate goals, but it will also raise the prices of electricity, changing the equation for customers. This is why I'm talking today about using these most efficient technologies, the ground source heat pump and the network ground source heat pump, to have a positive cost and efficiency impact on our electric grid. And unfortunately, for most pricing considerations, when you look at a project, you're not looking at the cost impacts of the electric grid. So that's the thing we want to flag today. Now, really quickly, next slide. I just want to point out that that was all US. And when you switch to a state that is colder, and I have two here, I apologize, we don't have it for Vermont. This is a quick screenshot from a submitted manuscript for Minnesota and Massachusetts. And you can see just quickly that the peaks are even higher. So Vermont being a cold climate state with heating buildings being a critical need, it is really important to think about the efficiency of how we switch our heating and what that means for our electric grid build out and costs. Next. So to support that point, I've got two case studies to share. This first one is one of those thermal energy networks that Debbie was describing so beautifully. And it has been in the ground for more than a decade, significantly more than a decade. It's out in Colorado Mesa, in the Mesa part of the West. And I apologize for the dog barking. I should have put him somewhere else. And this is just a quick sense of it. And I love this little geo image here, but it has been growing since 2008. It's currently 1.2 million square feet. Next slide. And again, it is a networked ground source heat pump or thermal energy network. So it's got the shared loop between buildings and it's got the borehole fields. Next. And I want to just quickly explain why. So you've got it in your head why that means you get more efficiency on that Falcon curve. And that's because you're actually sharing energy between buildings, even without the boreholes. Next slide. And when you add the boreholes, you're actually able to store energy so you can cancel the loads between buildings over time. And so this is how you're actually getting those crazy efficiency and load flattening for the grid. Next. And then the other part that's wonderful is because they're single pipe ambient temperature, you can keep building new loops and interconnecting them. So a town center can, like Debbie's beautiful image, start out and then incrementally over time grow, which is exactly what happened at Colorado Mesa University. Next. There we go. We grew a grid. We're good. Next slide. Quickly at Colorado Mesa, they began with just 2 or 3 buildings and then continued to add new loops. There are now 5 interconnected loops. Next slide. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, this has been done. And there's more case studies than this one, but I love sharing this one. There's 2.5 miles of central loop pipe. There's 8 separate borehole fields, 427 boreholes, around 1,000 heat pumps distributed around all these buildings. And they have additional attachments of cooling towers and gas boilers that are there for backup. Now, the boilers have not fired once, have not been needed to fire once to cover or back up the network geothermal. The cooling towers have been used for very hot days. Next slide. Just an image, because I'm an image person. This is what it looks like in their plants. They actually had a savings on square footage of buildings because their mechanics rooms needed to be smaller. They used less mechanical space with these systems. Next. And so these are the outcomes. And we're publishing a case study that will be coming by hopefully soon. It's taking a while, together with the Gray Edge Group and Colorado Mesa University. And the buildings so far have cost $8.2 million for the installation. And they are currently documenting $1 million per year in energy savings directly. They've calculated about 8 MMTs of carbon dioxide per year reduction or savings. And 100% of their heating is covered. One of the things that's popped up there that's quite extraordinary and less relevant to us here in the Northeast is that they cut their water use by 60%. Of course, that is still savings, whether you have water or don't, like in Colorado. Next. And so coming back to our Falcon curve and our impact on the electric grid, this is data from that installation. And for a period of 3 years, they grew from 800,000 square feet to 1,200,000 square feet. And at the end of that, their energy provider, Xcel Energy, apparently sent them a note with this graph saying, what the is going on? Why is your load not growing? And as you can see, the range, these are monthly dots for these years, has not significantly grown their electricity usage, despite the square footage growing. The system has really flattened the peak of electric. And so that's a really fascinating outcome that we're studying more, and more of these systems going in are having the same kind of impact. So there's your electric grid impact that we've got to find a way to quantify and value in our calculations and estimates of what our energy transition should look like. Next slide. And of course, the key point is emissions. And so I just want to point out that, depending on your electric grid and how fast you can get there, this is for Massachusetts. In 2019, it would be a 60% reduction. And if we get to our climate goals in terms of our electric grid, by 2050, it would be over 80%. And if we get our electric grid to zero, then this is zero. And that's beautiful. Next. And in the meantime, very important, it keeps the costs to customers low. It's less electricity running your heat pumps for a ground source or network ground source heat pump than for a air source heat pump. So that's a critical part, is affordability. Next. All right, so now I'm going to briefly cover in a minute or two a rural electric co-op in Oklahoma. And thank you to Boyd Lee for this data from his slides. And they deployed individual ground source heat pumps. And they've got some data. So speaking of that data, we need to calculate the impact on the grid. So they have this system where their co-op actually owns and recovers the cost of the ground source heat pump. They install the system, they cover the install costs, they get all of the improvements to their electric grid load factor. They get their incremental kilowatt hour revenue. And the members of their co-op get lower total energy bills, service and reliability from their utility, and no reduced or no incremental cost for participating. So it seems to be a win-win, and they've been at this for more than 10 years. Next slide. 1,000 ground source heat pumps installs in, this is what it looked like for them. They had an enormous demand reduction, which was for them a equivalent of $467,000 a year. They got new sales for kilowatt hours, equivalent to 390. And so they were making money by deploying ground source heat pumps for their customers and use that to incentivize those ground source heat pumps. Most recently, Boyd told me that he makes back the cost of an individual ground source heat pump in less than a year based just on his load factor. Next slide. And they now today, after 10 years, they own $11 million of assets in geoloops. And they've had this successful business while really decarbonizing, which is our goal, right? And so I think this is a relevant case study for more rural areas where you can make it be good business to deploy ground source heat pumps. Of course, again, if you do the networked in town centers and more urban areas, then you actually get even better outcomes. So next slide. All right, I couldn't help but show a picture of the install going in Framingham. And that one is biogas utility and providing all of their resources, but now for this totally emissions-free ground source heat pump network. And we'll be providing all of the data. Next slide. Totally open, and there will be multiple projects where we're going to be putting all of the data in an open data bank, hopefully allowing us to further quantify the impacts so that we can start correctly assessing the costs, not just looking at our boiler to heat pump conversion, but looking at the electric grid impacts as well. Next slide. This you're going to hear more about, but this has gone national. There are states across the country. This is a meeting with Secretary of Energy, and she's concerned about the impact on the electric grid. And this is part of what is the story that is happening across the country in all different kinds of states. Next. And of course, there's a great opportunity you're going to hear more about next. Next slide. In terms of cost reductions that are even there for the next few years. So basically, I wanted to leave by saying, in considering and reimagining our energy system to get us to our climate goals, we really need to think about so many different factors, most of which I didn't touch on, but the intersection of our thermal energy system, which we talk so much less about sometimes than electric, with our electric energy system, and the cost impacts of our decisions about thermal building electrification must be part of our equation. We have to figure out how to use policy and our own accounting mechanisms to actually quantify that and make sure we're making the optimized decisions so we have our best chance of meeting our goals. All of our materials are open source, and this is a little QR code to join a map across the country we just launched saying you're interested in geo. All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it now to Jeff and Ryan, who are going to tell you way more details about all of the opportunity nationally.
Thank you, Zeyneb. That was inspiring. I'm so grateful for all the work of HEET, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks, Debbie and Jonathan, for organizing this. I'm coming to you from here in central Illinois, where it will be 84 degrees today, and tornadoes are expected again. We just had several just a few days ago. So, you know, the time for this conversation has never been more appropriate or needed. It's clear that buildings are a huge part of the equation. If you go back just a few years, the focus in terms of clean energy was on generation and transportation largely. But I've been buoyed, and it's been very gratifying to see in the last several years that there's been a renewed or invigorated focus on the role of buildings in the big picture. So let's talk a little bit about GeoExchange and IGSHPA. If we could go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about who we are and the role we play within the geothermal heat pump world. GeoExchange and IGSHPA are sister organizations. We work very, very closely together, but have different focuses. And those focuses do have a tendency to intermingle and overlap. You can see in this Venn diagram, sort of the shared responsibilities. GeoExchange is really the voice of the industry in public policy circles. We are sort of advocacy oriented. Our focus historically has been in Washington, D.C. We've been working there for over a decade now, building support within Congress and at the executive level. And I think we've had some good success at that. I'm going to talk about some of that success in a moment. IGSHPA is the flip side of that coin. You can't just be focused on policy development without focusing on the needs of the market, the importance of workforce development. We had a monumental victory in the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's driving a lot of interest in the technology, but who's going to do the work? Well, that's where IGSHPA comes in. Their responsibility is training a skilled workforce and ensuring that they have the resources and the education necessary to develop and design and implement these systems. That's a key consideration with geothermal heating and cooling technology. It has to be designed and installed properly for it to work. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about conveying this technology to end users and consumers. These are some diagrams or schematics showing how geothermal works. And there's a tendency in the geothermal world to get into the nuts and bolts of a geothermal system, using the ground as a thermal battery of sorts. There's something called a delta T, there's manual J's, you have to calculate building loads. There's a lot of physics and thermodynamics involved, but why should we focus on this? I recently got solar panels on my house. I don't even really know how they work. Just before this, I had to Google it right before this webinar. Who's here today that knows about silicon doping and how, whether it's polycrystalline or monocrystalline silicon, and do you dope it with phosphorus on top and boron on the bottom? Who cares? It's free energy from the sun. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's important to just think about the key aspects of geothermal. If a consumer or if somebody wants to get into the nitty-gritty of how it works, that's fine. We'll take them on that journey. But the key considerations when it comes to this technology are that it is the most efficient and cost-effective heating and cooling technology in existence. It has the most benefits for the environment and for grid resiliency, and it keeps you very, very comfortable throughout the year. The website that I've linked there, Geothermal for All, is a consumer-oriented website just for people to dip their toe into. And the brochure we've developed on the right, which I'm happy to provide to folks after this call, is a really simple guide for homeowners to get introduced to the technology. Let's go to the next slide. As I was talking about building narratives, I think about all of the stakeholders, many of whom are on this call. I was amazed to see the diversity of backgrounds and affiliations that have dialed in today. We need not only to influence and inform consumers, but we also need to inform stakeholders. I call them gatekeepers. These are folks who have sort of the keys to our future in their hands in a lot of ways. They are the architects, the engineers, the designers, the elected officials, the real estate developers. There's so many key stakeholder groups that we have to develop messaging for And that's exactly what we're doing between GeoExchange and IGSHPA. We have to be consistent on our messaging. We have to really paint a picture for them about the power and potential of this technology. And so that's what we're doing. We're building out sort of a portfolio or a profile of relevant facts and figures. And let's skip to the next slide and talk a little bit about that. What does geothermal do for us? And what is the portrait of the industry today? The cover page that's illustrated here is from a 2017 report, the GeoVision analysis, which was done by the U.S. Department of Energy's Geothermal Technologies Office. This is a really important and groundbreaking examination of the potential for geothermal heating and cooling. The report itself covers a wide array of the whole spectrum of geothermal technologies, from the high temperature geothermal energy production down to lower temperature geothermal heating and cooling, which can be deployed anywhere. This technology is not new. It's been around for decades, and there are, over 1.5 million systems in existence and operation today. There's a lot of people employed in this industry. By our estimate, it's over 40,000 individuals. There's a tremendous amount of carbon that can be reduced through the deployment of geothermal at 1.3 million metric tons of carbon if we follow the roadmap that's laid out in the GeoVision analysis. We expect geothermal to grow very, very rapidly. And there's more and more reports coming out about geothermal. Not long ago, a consulting firm in Ontario, the Dunsky Group, analyzed the value and the potential of geothermal heating and cooling. I would urge everyone to take a look at that. There was also the Brattle Group that analyzed the potential of geothermal heating and cooling in Rhode Island. I just dropped a link in the chat for that. And most recently, RMI came out with a great little primer on geothermal that's now posted at their website. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to very quickly talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. And if we could go to the next slide, there's an image of President Biden signing this monumental, historic law bill into law. This is a game changer, and it amazes me, and I guess it's a reflection of how deeply involved we were with the creation of this. It didn't come out overnight, even though it was a surprise when the IRA was introduced. Who remembers Build Back Better? That's something we don't tend to talk about a lot, but this was in process for a very long time, and we had a role in the crafting of it. And there is an untold, vast amounts of money that are available for geothermal heating and cooling. Let's skip to the next slide, and I'll very quickly talk about some of the provisions. Homeowners can get a 30% uncapped tax credit for installation of geothermal heating and cooling equipment. There are going to be state rebates, which are going to be issued by the Vermont's Energy Office, that will be available either late this year or early next. There are commercial incentives. The investment tax credit has a 30% rate, which then can be bumped up to 50% if you capture certain bonus provisions. Half of your system could be paid for. And for nonprofit entities, units of local government, they can get a direct payment from the U.S. Treasury for the cost of their installation. There are new credits for home builders for creating energy efficient homes. There's major deductions that are available. You can stack many of these together too. And we're talking about geothermal heat pumps being basically the most financially responsible technology for deployment. I'm getting really close to time, so let's zip through the last couple slides here. I would urge everyone to take a look at Rewiring America's IRA calculator. It's a fantastic resource for homeowners. You can plug in a few numbers and see how it all fits together Rewiring has a lot of great resources on their website, and I often direct people to check them out to see what is available and how it all adds up. I'm going to end there and just about 30 seconds over time and pass it off to Jeff to talk about some really important developments in the world of training and standards.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Debbie and Jonathan, for allowing me to join this exciting webinar and great presentations from Zeyneb and Ryan. I'll talk a little bit more on the technical side here. If we could go to the next slide. And the first item here is talking about standards. There's a lot of bullet points here. There are really two key points that are important with our technology, whether it be a thermal network or whether it be a single building. As we grow, and hopefully as Vermont sees a lot more of this technology, we really need to look at consistency of design and installation. And that's where the standard comes into play here is, you know, we want quality installations. We expect large growth, and we have to have some sort of reference point for our industry. You know, we want to make sure everybody's designing them relatively close to the same, they're installed the same, and we have long-term reliability. These systems can last, you know, 24 plus years for the heat pump, and the piping system we think is around 100 years. So we'd like to do it right the first time. The second point that's important with the standard is we need a way to reference the requirements for local jurisdictions. And so having a standard that we can refer to gives us a way to make sure we do that. Let's go to the next slide, please. The standard that I'm talking about is the binational standard. It's an ANSI CSA IGSHPA standard. The current edition is 2016. And the IGSHPA standards, in fact, will be sunset when we come out with the next edition at the end of this year. What's great about this standard is it's continually evolving. So our 2016 standard is very useful for the points I mentioned earlier, but our next edition ties directly into this conversation today. What's called geothermal systems here on the bullet point towards the bottom, that's also called thermal energy networks. And so there will be a dedicated section just to this particular topic right at the end of the year. Also, energy foundations, some people call them energy piles, where we're seeing a lot more activity there. As we build new buildings, let's take advantage of that bore that's already created. Debbie mentioned sewer waste energy recovery. Every time I stay at a hotel, I think of all that hot water that goes down the drain. Might as well use that resource. And so there's just a lot that happens each time there's an update. Please go to the next slide. Some of the guidance that we can expect through a binational standard like this is just, you know, how to design the system. For a residential system, it talks about how to calculate the heat loss, heat gain, how to size the ductwork, what temperatures we should be designing for, what are appropriate antifreezes, and so forth. So that's all important to make sure that we actually accomplish what our goals are. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is just a quick example, and this comes up all the time. So what should my loop temperature be designed for? What's our minimum temperature? And this chart simply shows a minimum temperature versus the mean ground temperature. So if we have a colder location versus a warmer location, we're going to have a colder or warmer ground temperature. And guidance like this can really keep us out of trouble. Let's go to that next slide, please. So tied in with standards really is, you know, the importance of training. We want to make sure that we not only know these standards, but we have to bring a lot of people into this industry if we're going to grow like we expect. And so workforce development is really crucial to make sure that we can ramp up with personnel, just like we ramp up with installations of these systems. Certification programs help us to do what I just talked about, consistency in design and standardization. But we want to make sure whether this is a single building or whether it's a thermal network system, we have the appropriate amount of heat exchanger in the ground. And if we're doing a thermal network system, we can move heat around. Maybe that causes us to, or allows us to have a little bit less heat exchange in the ground. So all this stuff is important that we know. I mentioned earlier the reliability. We want these systems to last for a long time. It's a big infrastructure expense, and we'd like to do it right. So training programs are available today for these new opportunities. Let's go to the next slide, please. The first and the oldest course that's out there is called the Accredited Installer course. And this has to do with the ground heat exchanger design and how the HVAC system is integrated. A lot of details on the IGSHPA.org website, but this has to do with start to finish, really. It's how the ground heat exchanger should be designed, the heat pump should be employed, and so forth. It's really important for installers, contractors, dealers, manufacturers, anybody who's a stakeholder in this industry, to make sure that their technical people have this type of training. This particular course provides NATE, which is North American Technician Excellence Certification, and IGSHPA certification. And it's primarily targeted at residential and light commercial design. So we see this as our most popular course. And in fact, some states like New York actually require this for their incentives program. So this is a great way to make sure that we have the right people in the right place. Let's go to the next slide, please. There's a commercial version of this training available called our Certified GeoExchange Designer, and it has similar attributes, but it's geared towards large commercial. So our professional engineers, registered architects, installers, and contractors should be looking at this certification, which is also an AEE, Association of Energy Engineers certification, along with IGSHPA. Next slide, please. As the industry grows, I expect to have a lot more specialization in training. So we may have people who are only looking at residential design. They're not actually part of the installation portion of it. So there are courses available from IGSHPA for just the design portion. Next slide. And this is an important part, especially on commercial. Inspection, construction oversight, those kind of things. There's a course available called the Certified Geothermal Inspector, which is for these particular individuals, those who are going to be looking at job sites, making sure that the site is per specification. They've installed the ground loops properly, they've grouted, those kind of things. So this is an important course as well. Next slide. And Debbie asked me to tie this all into the potential for Vermont. I'm happy to say I spent some time last month in Vermont, and it's pretty neat to see everything that's going on with the incentives and the striving for 100% clean energy. So let's take a look at some the next slide here just to see what we can do in Vermont specifically when it comes to clean energy. If you look at where the natural gas is available, and I pulled this map from a report in 2022. I have some information coming up on that, but it's a pretty small area where natural gas is available. This is a little bit confusing with the colors. The brighter blue on the left side of that map is actually Lake Champlain, so that's not gas territory. Kind of the gray territory right around the purple line in the northwest corner of the state is actually the natural gas availability. So you can see that there's a large population there, but it's a relatively small area geographically. So most of the state is going to have to heat with fuel oil, propane, some sort of electric technology, or wood. And how are we going to accomplish that? You know, Zeynep had a great slide with the Falcon graph that showed what happens with the various electric technologies. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at some of our options here. This sort of ties into that Falcon graph, but I also included fossil fuels. We have to really look at all of our options so that we can make the best decisions. Our top bar here, electric resistance, is not one that we would want to implement, but it certainly gives us a comparison to some of the other technologies. I just took a typical 2,500 square foot home in Burlington, Vermont, and I used a report that showed average state electricity and natural gas prices and national propane and oil costs, so we could tie that in to how all this works together. As you can see, natural gas, where it's available, is pretty competitive. It's second on the list in that yellow bar, but that's only available in Northwest Vermont. So if we were to look outside of that portion of the state, then we have our choice of propane, fuel oil, or an electric technology. And the two electric technologies I'm showing here are geothermal and air source heat pumps. So from a consumer standpoint, this is something we have to consider, especially for electrifying our system. How does that impact the consumer's operating costs on an annual basis? Let's go to the next slide. And then when we do build out that clean energy, we have to consider what's going to happen with the grid. Again, back to Zeynep's chart, we wouldn't necessarily want to look at electric resistance, but we also have to consider what happens when it's -6 degrees outside. And in Burlington, that's the design temperature. So it doesn't happen very often. That's 2.5% of the time. But when it does happen, that's when the grid has to be geared up to handle that. So when we look at an air source heat pump versus a ground source heat pump, the ground source heat pump doesn't care what the temperature is outside. That ground temperature is relatively the same year round. And so we have the ability to put in an awful lot more ground source systems and maintain our grid a little bit better. That's not to say air source heat pump technology is bad, especially the newer air source heat pumps are really impressive. It's just that we have to look at selectively at how we apply those. You can see here, put in about twice as many ground source heat pump systems as we can air source when it comes to looking at how the grid might be impacted there. And let's go to the next slide, please. So how can Vermont lead the way? I would love to see this happen. I'm impressed with what's happening. But we have to look at this from a larger picture. We know what natural gas piping infrastructure looks like. In fact, there was a map that we looked at a little bit earlier. What could we do with ground source heat exchangers, thermal energy networks, and even individual buildings? That's part of the infrastructure. If that pipe in the ground is going to last 100 years plus, it's really no different than if we were to put in gas lines, except that we're dedicating these resources to a particular building or a thermal energy network, and it doesn't need any fuel. Once we put that pipe in the ground, it's there for however long it's going to last. What's really nice about it is it can provide new business opportunities. And so as we start to move towards electrification, we already have drillers available. We already have excavators available. We certainly need a lot more of them. But it's an opportunity for utilities to build geo infrastructure instead of gas piping. So these are assets that the utility companies can utilize. We may even have opportunities for fuel oil and propane companies to get into this business. They might as well own a loop instead of a tank. It's the same concept essentially, but it just is a longer term asset that's going to allow them to capitalize that business a little bit better. A lot of new job creation, and you never know what might come out of this. Nonprofit models, rural models, like Zeynep mentioned about with CK Energy. So all of these things work together. Thermal energy networks we could use in mixed use areas, single buildings. There's just a lot of opportunities for utilizing this technology. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to go through some of the technical side of the technology, and I think we're ready for questions.
Thanks, Jeff and Ryan and Zeynep as well. Those were fascinating expressions. I love, Ryan, save money, save the planet, and be extremely comfortable doing both. That's a great tagline. And I think that's something that when we talk about the energy transition, we need to be emphasizing more broadly. We're not asking people to use technologies that are less than. In many cases, we're asking people to use technologies that are better. There's no air pollutants near a solar panel. The geothermal heating quality is fantastic. Electric vehicles have really great performance. So, in many ways, the whole clean energy revolution is about convincing people to take a better option for themselves that's also better for the planet. So I'm thrilled that you were able to summarize that so concisely. I'm going to take a moment to react to Zeynep's post showing the diminishing smokestacks in Massachusetts, and just raise for people that there is a renewable energy standard reform bill also in the House right now. That's H320. That would move Vermont to 100% renewable energy by 2030. Happy to talk more with folks about that who are interested. But again, thinking about this as an ecosystem, getting us to 100% renewable energy that can power these kind of systems is, really the optimal ideal here, where we're getting both. We have just a couple of minutes for questions here, and maybe we can stretch our time just a little bit. But we had a question, Zeyneb, and I think this one will go to you, about how electric utility demand in that rural example with the CK Energy, how their demand was able to drop even as they were adding a new source of load there. Can you talk a little bit more about how that worked?
Yeah, and I believe to be very specific, their demand peak dropped, which is you're using more electricity when you move your fossil fuel heating to a ground source heat pump. And because of the nature of ground source heat pumps and their capacity for energy storage and their efficiency, they can raise the trough of your electric grid demand curve and lower the peak. And so what he was talking about is a drop in the demand peak, Boyd Lee of CK Energy, and not a aggregate less energy use. The electric company, as you might have noticed, the electric co-op actually made money on more energy sales, even while their demand peak got shallower.
Thanks for that clarification, and managing that peak, so that everybody here in the chat knows that's like really crucial for managing system costs as well. So that's a huge benefit.
That determines how much you're paying for electricity.
Yeah. We had a couple of questions about costs, and I know it's going to vary a lot across project specifics, but any of our three experts want to talk about sort of upfront versus payback? And I know the operating costs of these systems are very low. Just any general information we can provide in that regard without getting too far into the weeds or trying to get a quote for a hypothetical system.
Well, I'll just throw out that I think Ryan and Jeff can handle the individual systems, but that the idea of using a utility allows us to remove the upfront costs, making it accessible to absolutely anyone, including a renter or a very low income customer. And that is an advantage over the individual. But I know that doesn't apply to every location. So I'll turn it over to Ryan and Jeff for the rest.
You'd like to take this, Ryan, or shall
I? Go for it, Jeff.
Okay. So the way I always look at it is if you look at the indoor equipment, which is the heat pump, the pricing for that equipment is about the same as a high efficiency gas furnace and a high efficiency central air conditioning system. So the difference is the ground loop. And that's an investment that you're going to make. It's part of the home. It varies all over the country, but that ground loop can, in general terms, cause the system to be 2 to 3 times the price of a conventional system. And that's because, again, that's just the ground portion of it, even though the equipment is about the same. As Zeyneb mentioned, if the utility is picking up that portion of it, then the equipment costs are virtually the same, really. So it's the ground loop, your energy source that you're putting in the ground that adds the extra cost.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a really helpful perspective. About areas with shallow water tables or where there's a significant watershed, and those present design challenges. Any thoughts or advice there?
Well, one of the things we talk about in our training courses is how the soil conductivity and the water subsurface affects the ground loop. And so we're going to take those into account when we do the calculations. For a commercial building, we would do an hour by hour load calculation. So we would study how that building's used. In residential, we'll look at a peak load calculation. So once we know what the building needs are, whether that's on a network system or whether that's on an individual loop, then we'll consider the ground conditions and we'll decide we need either more or less pipe in the ground. But the end result is the performance is going to be the same. So it's going to vary greatly by geography. If there's a lot of rock, it's better conductivity. So now we maybe need a little bit less loop. If it's a thermal network system, and we happen to have a really large heating load, maybe we're heating hot water, and at the same time we're trying to cool, then we're just moving heat around. So those are all considerations that that are taken into account when we do the calculations. But not that it doesn't matter. I don't want to minimize the question, but it's all considered as part of the calculations.
Terrific. We've got a comment in the chat noting that wind power, which has a winter peak, works really well with heat pumps, but also noting that it's been all but impossible to build here in Vermont. So I will just say on REV's behalf that we'd really like to see that changed again. The way we get to a clean energy future is with a widespread, diverse range of technologies on both the generation and consumption side. So thank you for flagging that. That's definitely a synergy that Vermont is not taking advantage of. We're kind of fighting with one hand behind our back right now as far as renewable development, as long as wind is not part of that picture. I am cognizant of the time here, and that we've asked our experts to stay here until 1. I see a few more comments in the chat. I think maybe we'll try and follow up with folks on that individually. I want to thank you again for coming. Debbie, do you have any closing words you'd like to share before we wrap here?
Just that I invite people to check out the Vermont Community Geothermal Association website, where we have a place you can sign up just to stay in the loop, so to speak. Sorry. And learn more about what's coming next after this webinar series. But I just want to appreciate people who've shown up for all 3. I see some of the same names coming around. And for people who came to this one, particularly some legislators, including Representative Mari Cordes, who's sponsoring H242, our bill, to make these thermal energy networks much more possible and affordable in Vermont. And thank you to REV. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.